Sons throw their 70-year-old mother out in the rain. It sounds like the beginning of a cruel joke or a dark fable, but for Elena, it was the chilling reality of a Tuesday afternoon. This is a story about that rain and about what comes after. It is a story about how the coldest betrayals can sometimes lead to the most unexpected warmth. The old house sighed around Elena, its wooden bones creaking with a familiar rhythm that had kept her company for 50 years. She sat at the small kitchen table, her gnarled fingers tracing the rim of a chipped porcelain mug. The mug was empty, but she held it for the phantom warmth it promised, a habit from a lifetime of making things last. Her hands, wrinkled and mapped with the fine lines of a long life, were a testament to her journey. They were hands that had kneaded dough, washed clothes by hand, soothed fevers, and held her husband's hand as he took his last breath in this very house. Today, they were packing memories. Not all of them, just a few precious things she thought her son Marco might want. She had carefully folded his first baby blanket, the one she had knitted herself, its yellow wool now faded to a pale cream. Beside it lay a tiny pair of scuffed leather shoes and a photograph of a smiling boy with a missing front tooth, his arms slung proudly around her neck. She placed these treasures in a small cardboard box, a final act of a mother's love. She did not know it was the final act. She thought it was just another Tuesday. She had cooked a pot of bean soup, Marco's favorite from his childhood, filling the small house with the humble, earthy smell. She waited, listening for the sound of a car engine, a sound that came less and less frequently these days. Her heart, a tired but hopeful muscle, fluttered with anticipation. When the sleek, silver car finally pulled up, it seemed to alienate the dusty road. It was too new, too quiet, too clean for the world she inhabited. Marco stepped out, looking like a man from a magazine. His suit was sharp, his shoes gleamed, and his hair was perfectly styled. He moved with an impatient energy that seemed to resent the slow pace of the countryside. Behind him, his wife, Isabella, emerged from the passenger side. She was a sculpture of cool elegance, her face a mask of polite indifference. She surveyed the small, weathered house with a faint, almost imperceptible curl of her lip, as if it were a curious but distasteful insect. She clutched a leather handbag that cost more than Elena had spent on groceries in a year. Elena's smile faltered slightly as she opened the door. "Marco, Isabella, you came." She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous gesture. "I made soup, your favorite." "We can't stay, Mother," Marco said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. He didn't step inside. He stood on the threshold, a barrier between his world and hers. "We need to talk." Isabella remained by the car, scrolling through her phone, utterly detached from the moment. She was a silent, powerful reinforcement of the message Marco was about to deliver. Her presence was a clear signal that this was business, not a family visit. "Talk? Of course, come in," Elena said, her voice wavering. But Marco held up a hand, stopping her. "It's about the house, Mother," he began, his eyes fixed on a point just over her shoulder. He couldn't meet her gaze. "I've sold it." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Elena felt the floor beneath her feet seem to fall away. "Sold it? But this is our home. Your father built this porch with his own hands." Her voice was a whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. "It was my home, yes, and Dad's," Marco corrected, his tone hardening. "But it's in my name now. You signed the papers years ago, remember? When I needed to secure the loan for my business. It was just a formality. Elena did remember. She remembered signing a stack of papers she didn't understand, her heart swelling with pride that she could help her educated son. I'm helping my Marco, she had told her neighbor. He had assured her it meant nothing, just paperwork, a formality. And the business is doing well, Mother. Very well, he continued, a note of pride creeping into his voice. We're expanding. Isabella and I are buying a new house in the city, a much better area. We needed the capital. Selling this place, it was the logical next step. A place for you, Isabella called from the car, her voice bored but clear. He's found a place for you. A wave of relief, weak and desperate, washed over Elena. A place? Oh, Marco, you should have said. I was so worried. Yes, a place, he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. It's all arranged. But you need to be out by this evening. The new owners are taking possession tomorrow. This evening? The words were impossible to understand. The soup was still warm on the stove. The box of memories was on the table. But, my things. You won't need most of it, Marco said dismissively. Just pack a small bag. Essentials. The new place is much smaller and furnished. As he spoke, cold and transactional, a memory flared in Elena's mind, as sharp and vivid as a lightning strike. Marco, 17 years old, his face pale with disappointment. The university he dreamed of had accepted him, but the fees were impossibly high. They had no money. Her husband, Daniel, had passed away a year before, leaving her with nothing but the house and his old silver watch. She saw herself walking to the pawn shop in the next town, the watch heavy in her palm. It was the only thing she had left of the man she loved, the ticking a faint echo of his heartbeat. She remembered the cold gaze of the pawnbroker, the paltry sum of money he pushed across the counter. She had handed it to Marco that evening. His eyes had lit up. He had hugged her, promising he would pay her back 1,000 times over. He never had. He had forgotten. The memory was so powerful, it stole her breath. She looked at the man standing before her in his expensive suit, and she could not see the boy she had sacrificed for. That boy was gone. In his place stood a stranger. A small bag, she repeated numbly. She turned and walked back into the house, her movements slow and robotic. She went to her bedroom and took the old worn coat from the hook behind the door. She found a small cloth bag and put in a change of clothes, her toothbrush, and the worn photograph of her and Daniel on their wedding day. She left the box of Marco's baby things on the table. He would not want them. When she came back out, Marco was looking at his watch, his foot tapping impatiently. Good. Are you ready? She nodded, not trusting her voice. She took one last look at the house, at the climbing roses her husband had planted, their leaves just beginning to turn for the autumn. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. Marco led her to the car, opening the back door for her. The leather seats were cold and slick. It smelled of vanilla and cleaning chemicals. Isabella didn't even turn around as Elena slid in. The silence in the car was a living thing, thick and suffocating. They drove away from the only home Elena had ever known. She watched it shrink in the rearview mirror until it was just a small, insignificant dot, and then it was gone. The sky, which had been a clear, crisp blue, was beginning to fill with gray, heavy clouds. The first drops of rain began to speckle the windshield. Marco drove for what felt like an eternity, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers marking the passage of time. Elena sat perfectly still in the back seat, her hands clasped tightly around the thin strap of her cloth bag. She watched the familiar countryside blur past, the fields and trees of her entire life dissolving into a watercolor of green and brown. Each passing landmark was a small cut, another piece of her past being severed. The car didn't head towards the city, where the nice new apartments were. It turned off the main highway and onto a series of smaller, less maintained roads. They were heading away from civilization, not towards it. A knot of cold dread began to form in Elena's stomach, tighter and more painful than hunger. Finally, the car slowed and pulled over. They were at a desolate, windswept bus station on the very edge of town. It was little more than a concrete slab with a rickety shelter, its plastic panes clouded with grime and graffiti. A single, flickering fluorescent light cast a sickly yellow glow on the wet pavement. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady, chilling drizzle. "This is it," Marco announced, his voice unnaturally loud in the confines of the car. He still hadn't turned to look at her. Elena was confused. "This? The new place is here?" She looked out at the bleak surroundings. There was nothing here but an empty road and fields stretching into the gloomy twilight. Marco finally turned, and for a fleeting moment, Elena saw a flicker of the little boy she remembered. A flicker of shame, of fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a hard defensive mask. "This isn't the place, Mother. This is a starting point." He reached into his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a thin wad of cash. He counted out a few bills and held them out to her. "Here, this should be enough for a few nights, in a motel, until you get settled." The cold dread in Elena's stomach turned to ice. The truth of the situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. There was no new place. There was no arrangement. This was it. This was the abandonment. "Marco," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What are you doing?" "It's for the best," he recited, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "You'll be better off. You can make a new start. You're strong." Isabella, finally breaking her silence, sighed dramatically from the front seat. "Marco, just get it over with. We'll be late for our reservation." His name, spoken by his wife, seemed to snap him back into his role. The hardness returned to his eyes. "Get out of the car, Mother." The words were quiet, but they were in order. Elena didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was frozen in disbelief. "Please, son, don't do this. It's raining. Where will I go?" "I told you. A motel," he said, his voice rising in frustration. He opened the door from the outside and thrust the money into her hand. "Take it. Now get out." He pulled her gently at first, then with more force. She stumbled out of the car and onto the wet concrete, the cold rain immediately plastering her thin cardigan to her skin. The silver car door clicked shut with an awful finality. She stood there, trembling, the crumpled bills clutched in her hand as the car's engine revved. She looked at her son's face through the rain-streaked window, her eyes pleading. He refused to look at her, staring straight ahead into the darkness. The car pulled away, its red taillights bleeding into the rain, getting smaller and smaller until they vanished completely. And then she was alone. The sound of the engine was replaced by the drumming of the rain on the flimsy shelter roof and the mournful whistle of the wind. The cold seeped into her bones, a deep, penetrating chill, that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of absolute abandonment. She huddled under the bus shelter, but it offered little protection. The wind drove the rain in from the sides, and a puddle was forming at her feet. She looked at the money in her hand. It wasn't enough. It was an insult. It was the price he had put on his mother. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She hadn't eaten since the small piece of toast she'd had for breakfast. The soup she had made for her son was still on the stove in a house that was no longer hers. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. She had to move. Staying here, she would freeze. Across the road, shrouded in mist and rain, she could just make out a familiar shape against the skyline. It was the old Miller farm. It had been abandoned for years, ever since old Mr. Miller had passed on. She and Daniel used to walk these fields when they were young, dreaming of their future. With no other options, she began to walk, her legs stiff and aching. The short distance across the road felt like miles. Mud sucked at her thin shoes, and the rain soaked her through. By the time she reached the dilapidated fence of the farm, she was shivering uncontrollably. She found a broken-down shack at the edge of the property, a place where the farmhands used to store tools. The door hung off one hinge, groaning in the wind. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. She slipped inside, the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and mouse droppings filling her nostrils. It was the smell of decay, of things left behind. It was the smell of her new life. She collapsed onto a pile of old, dusty burlap sacks in the corner, pulling them around her for a sliver of warmth. The shivering wouldn't stop. Through a crack in the wall, she could see the distant, indifferent lights of the town. Somewhere out there, her son was sitting in a warm restaurant, celebrating his success. He was eating a fine meal, while his mother sat in a ruined shack, her stomach aching with hunger and her heart shattered into a million pieces. She closed her eyes, and the darkness that claimed her was a small mercy. The next morning, Elena awoke to a world of gray. The rain had subsided to a persistent, miserable drizzle. Every muscle in her body ached, and a deep, rattling cough had settled in her chest. The hunger was a gnawing beast in her belly. She knew she couldn't stay here. She needed to find help. She needed to try one more time. She remembered a payphone at a gas station about a mile down the road. With trembling fingers, she fished a few coins from the bottom of her bag. Coins she had saved for emergencies. This, she thought, with a grim sense of despair, certainly qualified. The walk to the gas station was a trial. Her shoes were soaked and offered no protection from the cold, wet ground. Every step was a painful effort. When she finally reached the phone, her hands were so cold and stiff she could barely dial the number. It was Marco's cell phone number, a number she knew by heart, a number she had called thousands of times for little chats, for good news, for comfort. She pressed the cold receiver to her ear and listened. A ring, another, and then a sterile, recorded voice. The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service. Disconnected. He had disconnected his number. He had cut the last, slender thread that connected them. She stood there, holding the receiver, listening to the robotic voice repeat the same heartless message. She didn't know what to do. She dialed again. And again. As if dialing it enough times would somehow make him answer. But the result was always the same. He was gone. He had made sure of it. Defeated, she let the receiver fall back into its cradle. She had to eat. She walked towards the small town, a place where she had lived her whole life, where everyone knew her name. Or they used to. She entered the small general store, the little bell above the door tinkling cheerfully, a sound that felt like a mockery. The man behind the counter was young, someone she didn't recognize. The old owner, Mr. Henderson, must have retired. "Can I help you?" the young man asked, his eyes flicking over her disheveled appearance, her damp coat, her muddy shoes. His tone was wary. "Yes," Elena said, her voice hoarse. I was wondering if I could get a loaf of bread and a can of beans. On credit. I'm Elena, Daniel's wife. I've been a customer here for 50 years. The young man's expression didn't soften. "Sorry, lady, we don't do credit. Company policy." "Please," she begged, the humiliation burning her cheeks. "I'll pay you back. I promise. I haven't eaten." "I can't help you," he said flatly, turning his attention to stacking cans on a shelf. His message was clear. She was no longer welcome here. She was a problem he didn't want. As she stumbled back out into the street, a car slowed down. It was Martha, her neighbor of 30 years, the woman she'd shared countless cups of coffee with over the garden fence. Elena's heart leaped with a desperate hope. "Martha!" she called out, taking a step towards the car. Martha saw her. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Elena saw recognition, then pity, then a quick, darting fear. Martha accelerated, her eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, leaving Elena standing alone on the sidewalk. She had seen her, and she had driven away. The public humiliation was a fresh, sharp pain on top of all the others. She was no longer Elena, the kind neighbor, Daniel's widow. She was a homeless woman, an embarrassment, a problem to be avoided. The town she had called home her entire life had turned its back on her. There was nowhere left to go. She trudged back to the abandoned shack, the only place in the world that would have her. She had nothing. No home, no money, no family, no friends. As she sank back onto the pile of damp sacks, a profound and terrifying loneliness washed over her. This was how it ended. Alone in a cold, dark shack, forgotten by everyone, huddled in the corner of the shack, trying to generate some warmth by rubbing her cracked hands together, Elena felt something strange. There was a lump in the lining of her old coat, something hard and rectangular. It was a coat she hadn't worn in years, one she had grabbed in her haste. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the worn fabric, searching for the source. She found a small tear in the lining and worked a finger inside, pulling at the object. It was a thick, yellowish envelope, sealed with wax that had gone brittle with age. Her heart gave a little flutter of recognition. Daniel. Her husband had given this to her just a few weeks before he passed. He had been so weak, his voice a mere whisper. "Elena," he had said, pressing the envelope into her hand. "Keep this safe. Don't open it. Not unless you have to. Not unless they truly forget you." She hadn't understood. Who, Daniel? Who would forget me? He had just looked at her with his tired, loving eyes. "Just promise me." She had promised. And then, in the fog of her grief, she had tucked the envelope into the coat pocket and forgotten all about it. Until now. "Unless they truly forget you." The words echoed in the desolate shack, a prophecy fulfilled. They had forgotten. With trembling fingers, she broke the brittle seal. Inside were not letters or photographs, but a sheaf of thick, important-looking documents. They were covered in legal language she couldn't understand, with seals and signatures from decades ago. At the top of the main document, she could make out the words, deed of title. And below that, her husband's name, Daniel, and a description of a plot of land, the Miller farm, all of it. She stared at the papers, confused. She knew they had owned their small house and the garden around it. But the whole farm, it seemed impossible. Daniel had been a simple carpenter, not a rich landowner. The papers must be a mistake, or some old, worthless documents he had kept for sentimental reasons. Disappointment washed over her. For a moment, she had allowed herself a sliver of hope. Just as she was about to push the papers aside, a voice from the doorway made her jump. "Ma'am, are you all right in there?" Standing in the crumbling doorway was a man. He was older, perhaps her own age, with a kind, weathered face and a shock of white hair. He was wearing a sturdy raincoat and leaning on a handsome wooden walking stick. I'm fine," Elena stammered, clutching the papers to her chest. The man took a step closer, his eyes full of concern. "I don't mean to intrude. My name is Arthur Jennings. I saw the light from my car. Well, I saw you walking this way earlier. I was worried." He looked at her closely. "You're shivering, and you look familiar. Wait a minute. Are you Elena? Daniel's Elena?" Elena's eyes widened. "You knew my Daniel?" A warm smile spread across Arthur's face. "Knew him? He was my best friend. From the time we were boys. We grew up on these fields." He gestured around the dilapidated shack. "I'm a lawyer, retired now. I was just driving by for old time's sake, and I saw you. What in God's name are you doing in this old place?" The kindness in his voice, the simple act of being recognized, of being seen, broke through the wall of despair Elena had built around herself. The story came pouring out of her in a torrent of quiet, desperate words. The sale of the house, the drive to the bus station, the disconnected number, the humiliation. She left nothing out. Arthur listened patiently, his expression growing darker and more thunderous with each word. He didn't interrupt. When she was finished, a heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of rain dripping through a hole in the roof. That boy," Arthur finally said, his voice tight with anger. "After everything you and Daniel did for him, unforgivable." He took a deep breath, composing himself. "Well, he won't get away with it. Not if I have anything to say about it." He then noticed the papers clutched in her hand. "What's that you've got there?" "I don't know," Elena said, her voice small. "Something Daniel gave me. I think it's just old papers." She handed the yellowish envelope to him. Arthur took out a pair of reading glasses from his pocket and began to examine the documents. He read the first page, then the second. His eyebrows shot up. He read them again, more slowly this time, his lips moving silently. "Elena," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "These aren't just old papers. Do you have any idea what this is?" She shook her head. "This is the original deed to the entire Miller farm. All 200 acres of it," he explained, his voice gaining excitement. "Daniel's father worked for Old Man Miller his whole life. When Miller passed, he had no heirs. He left the whole property to Daniel's father, as a thank you for his loyalty. Your father-in-law was a humble man. He never told anyone. He just kept living in his small cottage. When he passed, it all went to Daniel. But this land is worthless," Elena said. "It's just rock and scrub." Arthur let out a short, sharp laugh. "That's what everyone thinks. That's the beauty of it." "Elena, This land isn't worthless. It's sitting on top of the largest untapped aquifer in the entire state. The city has been desperately trying to secure water rights for years to support that new Northgate luxury development project. They've been searching for the owner of this worthless plot of land for months. They think it's some long-lost corporation. He tapped the deed with his finger. They were looking for a ghost, but the owner is you. He looked at her, his eyes shining. Elena, you're not homeless. You're not poor. You're the most powerful woman in this county. You're a millionaire. Many times over. Elena stared at him, the words not making any sense. Millionaire. Her. The woman in the muddy shoes. Huddled in a shack. It was too much to comprehend. All she could do was stare at the papers in his hand. The last gift from a husband who had tried to protect her, even from beyond the grave. While his mother shivered in a broken-down shack, Marco was basking in the warm glow of success. He sat in the most exclusive restaurant in the city, a place of hushed tones, gleaming silverware, and starched white tablecloths. A crystal chandelier dripped light onto the table, making the bubbles in his champagne glass sparkle like tiny diamonds. "To my brilliant husband," Isabella said, raising her glass. Her smile was radiant, but it didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "The youngest vice president of acquisitions in the history of Sterling Properties. I'm so proud." "To us," Marco corrected, clinking his glass against hers. "We're a team." He took a long sip of the champagne. It was crisp, expensive, and tasted like victory. He had done it. He had clawed his way out of the dirt-poor background that had haunted him his entire life. He was a success. Across the table, Isabella's father, a formidable man named Mr. Sterling, who owned the company Marco worked for, nodded in approval. "You've done well, son. This Northgate project is going to be your masterpiece. A legacy." "I'm just happy to have earned your trust, sir," Marco said, his voice smooth and deferential. "Nonsense," Sterling boomed. "You've got the killer instinct. I like that." He took a bite of his steak. "Speaking of which, any news on that last parcel of land? The old Miller farm? We can't break ground until we secure it." Marco felt a familiar flash of irritation. The Miller farm was the one frustrating snag in his otherwise perfect plan. "My team is working on it around the clock, sir. The ownership is a mystery. Some defunct holding company from the 1950s. But don't worry, we'll find a way. We'll get it. I always deliver." "I know you do," Sterling said. Then he leaned forward, his expression turning more personal. "You know, Marco, I've always admired you. You're a self-made man. No family baggage. No handout from a rich father. You built this all yourself." The compliment landed like a stone in Marco's stomach. Family baggage. He thought of his mother, of her cracked hands, her simple clothes, the smell of bean soup clinging to her hair. He thought of the shame he felt whenever his sophisticated friends had met her. He forced a confident smile. "That's right, sir. My parents passed away when I was very young. I've been on my own my whole life." The lie came easily. He had practiced it so many times, it almost felt true. He saw Isabella nod approvingly. This was the story they had agreed upon, the narrative that fit their new life. A poor, hard-working orphan who had made good. It was so much cleaner, so much more impressive than the truth. The truth was a 70-year-old woman in a run-down house who reminded him of everything he was desperate to escape. "A true testament to your character," Sterling said, raising his glass again. "To Marco." As they toasted, Marco's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his lead paralegal. Still no luck on Miller Farm ownership. It's a ghost. He shoved the phone back in his pocket, a flicker of unease disturbing his perfect evening. The entire Northgate project, his promotion, his new house, the life he had built with Isabella, it all hinged on acquiring that one last stubborn piece of worthless land. He pushed the thought away. He was Marco, the man who always found a way. He would solve this problem just like he had solved the problem of his mother, by getting rid of it, quickly and quietly. He took another sip of champagne and smiled at his beautiful wife. He had everything he had ever wanted. The next few days were a blur for Elena. Arthur, with the ferocious energy of a retired bulldog who had finally found a worthy fight, took charge of everything. He brought her from the shack to his own comfortable home, where his wife, Clara, fussed over her, feeding her warm broth and wrapping her in soft blankets. For the first time in a very long time, Elena felt safe. Arthur worked the phones like a master conductor. He called in favors from half a century of legal practice. He brought in appraisers, surveyors, and geologists who confirmed what he already knew. The water under the Miller farm was pure, plentiful, and critically located. It was, as one of the experts put it, liquid gold. The news traveled fast. Within a day, a delegation from the city's development corporation was sitting in Arthur's formal living room. They were slick, nervous men in expensive suits, the same kind of men as her son. They made an offer, a number with so many zeros, Elena couldn't count them. Arthur just smiled. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "you seem to be under the impression that you are here to negotiate a purchase. You are not. You are here to bid for a lease on the water rights. My client, the sole owner of the property, has a deep respect for this land. She has no intention of selling it to developers who wish to cover it in concrete." Elena watched, amazed. Arthur spoke for her, but he was channeling the spirit of her Daniel, a man who loved the earth. He negotiated a deal that was staggering in its scope. The city would pay a fortune for the water, and in return, the land itself would be turned into a protected nature preserve named after her late husband. Then, Arthur made another call. He found the couple who had just bought Elena's little house. They were a young family, and they were shocked when an old, distinguished lawyer appeared on their doorstep. Arthur explained the situation without malice, and then he made them an offer. He offered them twice what they had paid for the house in cash on behalf of his client. 2 days later, Elena stood on the porch of her own home. Her home. The young couple, thrilled with their unexpected windfall, had moved out immediately. Arthur had hired a cleaning crew, and the house was spotless. The smell of chemical cleaners had been replaced by the scent of fresh flowers, which Clara had placed on the kitchen table. Elena walked through the rooms, touching the walls, the furniture. It was all the same, yet everything was different. She was different. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer a victim. She was the owner of her life. Meanwhile, in a glass and steel office tower across the city, Marco's world was beginning to fracture. He was in a meeting with his father-in-law and the board of Sterling Properties, presenting his final aggressive strategy for acquiring the Miller farm. "We'll petition the court to declare the property abandoned," he said confidently. "We'll argue it's a public nuisance. It's a surefire tactic. It may take a few months, but we will get the land." Just then, his assistant burst into the room, her face pale. "Mr. Marco, you need to see this. It's all over the financial news." She placed a tablet on the table. The headline read, "Mysterious Ghost. Landowner Solves City's Water Crisis. Inks multi-million-dollar deal for Miller Farm Aquifer." Marco's blood ran cold. He snatched the tablet. The article detailed the entire story: the long-lost deeds, the massive aquifer, the brilliant deal struck with the city. And then he saw it. A small, slightly blurry photograph accompanying the article. It was a picture of the landowner's lawyer, a smiling, white-haired man named Arthur Jennings. And next to him, standing on the steps of the county courthouse, was a small, elderly woman in a simple coat. He stared at the face. He would have known it anywhere. It was his mother. "What is it?" Mr. Sterling demanded, snatching the tablet from his hands. He read the headline, and his face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He read the article, his eyes scanning the text with furious speed. He looked from the picture on the screen to Marco's ashen face. "Your mother," Sterling whispered, the words dripping with venom. "You told me she was dead." The room fell silent. Everyone was staring at Marco, the man who was self-made, the man with no family baggage. I can explain," Marco stammered. "Explain what?" Sterling roared, slamming the tablet on the table. "Explain how you let the most valuable piece of real estate in the state slip through your fingers. Explain how it was bought by your own mother, who you told me was dead. Explain how this masterpiece project of yours is now completely, utterly, and irrevocably dead." He stood up, his massive frame towering over Marco. "You're not just incompetent. You're a liar. You're fired. Get out of my building. Get out of my sight." Marco stumbled out of the conference room, the glares of his former colleagues like physical blows. His career, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled in an instant. He took the elevator down to the lobby in a daze. When the doors opened, Isabella was standing there, her face like a thundercloud. "My father just called me," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "He told me everything." "Isabella, baby, I can fix this," he pleaded. "We can fix this." "We?" She laughed, a short, ugly sound. "There is no we, Marco. I married a winner, a vice president. Not some pathetic fired liar whose own mother just humiliated him in front of the entire city. I'm going back to my father's house. My lawyers will be in touch." She turned and walked away without a backward glance, her heels clicking a death march on the marble floor. He was left standing in the lobby, alone, fired, his wife gone, his life in ruins. And at the center of it all was the woman he had left at a bus station in the rain. A desperate, wild idea began to form in his mind. She was his mother. She had to help him. She had always helped him. The walk back to his childhood home was the longest journey of Marco's life. He didn't take a cab. He couldn't afford one. He walked. The expensive leather shoes that had been a symbol of his success now pinching his feet, rubbing his heels raw. Each step was a step backward in time, a retreat from the gleaming city into the past he had tried so hard to erase. He passed the park where his mother had taught him to ride a bike, the corner store where she bought him ice cream when he scraped his knee. Each landmark was a fresh accusation, a silent witness to his betrayal. The shame was a physical thing, a heavy coat he couldn't take off. By the time he reached the familiar dusty road, night had fallen. He saw lights on in the house. A warm, yellow glow spilled from the windows, a beacon of the comfort and safety he had so casually thrown away. The garden, which had been overgrown and sad, was now tidy. The climbing roses on the porch seemed to stand a little taller. He walked up the path his father had laid, and his hand hesitated over the doorbell. What was he doing here? What could he possibly say? But desperation was a powerful motivator. He had nothing left, no one else to turn to. He pressed the button. He heard soft footsteps, and then the door opened, and there she was, Elena. She wasn't the broken, shivering woman he had left in the rain. She was wearing a simple, clean blue dress. Her hair was neatly combed. There were new lines around her eyes, lines of sorrow, perhaps, but also lines of strength. She looked peaceful. "Marco," she said. Her voice was not angry, not surprised. It was calm, level, as if she had been expecting him. The sight of her, the sound of his name spoken in that familiar, gentle tone, broke him. The carefully constructed facade of the successful man shattered, and he was just a lost little boy again. He fell to his knees on the porch, the one his father had built. "Mother," he sobbed, the tears coming in great shuddering gasps. "Mother, I'm so sorry. I am so, so sorry." He reached out, grabbing the hem of her dress like a drowning man clutching at a rope. "I made a terrible mistake, a horrible, unforgivable mistake. I've lost everything. My job, Isabella, the house, everything. It's all gone." He looked up at her, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "I need you, Mother. Please. You have to help me. Forgive me. Can't we just go back? Can you help me get back on my feet?" His words, even to his own ears, sounded pathetic and selfish. They were all about him, his loss, his needs. Elena did not move. She looked down at her son, the stranger kneeling at her feet, and she felt not anger, but a vast, profound sadness. She gently pulled her dress from his grasp. "Sit up, Marco," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She gestured to the top step of the porch. "Sit here." He did as he was told, wiping his face on the sleeve of his now ruined designer suit. She didn't sit next to him. She remained standing, looking out at the dark fields beyond her garden. "I remember the day you were born," she began, her voice a soft, melodic murmur. "The doctor said you were a big baby. You weighed almost 9 pounds. Your hands were so small, but your grip was so strong. You held my finger and wouldn't let go." She paused, lost in the memory. "I looked at my own hands, already rough from working in the fields, and I made a promise to you, a silent promise. I promised that your hands would never have to be as rough as mine, that you would have a better life, a life of the mind. I remember when you were 5, and you wanted that red bicycle in the shop window more than anything in the world. It was so expensive. Your father and I, we ate nothing but potatoes for a month, so we could save up enough to buy it for you. The look on your face on your birthday, it was worth 100 months of eating potatoes." "And I remember," she said, her voice dropping a little lower, "the day I sold your father's watch. The university sent a letter. You were so excited, but your face fell when you saw the tuition fees. I walked to town that day, to the pawn shop. That watch was the last piece of him I had. The ticking was like a memory of his heart beating next to mine. I sold it for paper, for books, for your future." She turned to look at him then, her eyes clear and steady in the porch light. "I stood at that bus station, Marco, in the cold and the rain where you left me, and I thought of all those things. I thought of the potatoes, and the bicycle, and the watch, and I didn't feel anger. I just felt a deep, deep sadness. Because the boy I did all that for, the boy I loved more than my own life, he would never have done that. He would never have left his mother in the rain. Marco began to weep again, a low, guttural sound of pure self-pity. I know, I'm a monster, but you can fix me. You can help me. You're my mother. Yes, she said, I am your mother. And a mother's love is a powerful thing. It can make you eat potatoes for a month. It can make you sell the last piece of your heart. But it cannot be a doormat for a stranger to wipe his feet on. Her voice was still quiet, but it had an edge of steel he had never heard before. You ask for my help now that you are broken. But when you were whole, you threw me away like I was garbage. You ask for forgiveness, but what you really want is a loan. You want me to fix the life you broke. You want me to put you back in the world that taught you to be ashamed of me. I forgive you, Marco, she said, and the words seemed to surprise him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. I forgive you for my own sake. I cannot carry that stone of bitterness in my heart. It is too heavy. So, I forgive you. She took a step back towards the open door of her home. But forgiveness is not forgetting, and it is not an open door. The son I raised is gone. Perhaps he never existed at all outside of my own hopeful heart. You are a stranger to me now, a man who wears my son's face, and I cannot let a stranger into my home. She looked at him one last time, this broken man sitting on her porch. Goodbye, Marco. And with that, she turned, stepped inside, and closed the door. The click of the lock was a small, quiet sound, but for Marco, it was as loud and final as a clap of thunder. Inside, Elena did not watch from the window. She walked to her kitchen, her sanctuary. The house was quiet, filled with the scent of lemon polish and the faint perfume of the roses from the garden. She put the kettle on the stove, her movement steady and deliberate. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the back door. It was Arthur, holding a newspaper. I saw his car was gone, he said gently. Are you all right? I am, Elena said, and she was surprised to find that it was the absolute truth. A great weight had been lifted from her. Would you like some tea, my friend? They sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where she had once packed a box of memories for a son who no longer existed. They drank their tea in a comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over the fields. Elena was alone, but she was not lonely. She was surrounded by the quiet dignity of her own life, a life she had reclaimed. She had found peace, not in revenge, but in the simple, powerful act of closing a door. Outside, Marco sat on the cold concrete bench of the bus station, the very same one where he had left his mother. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of rain. He sat under the flickering, sickly light, a man with no past and no future. He was truly, utterly alone, left with nothing but the consequences of his own choices. Some doors, once they are closed and locked, can never be reopened. Not because the key is lost, but because the person on the other side has finally changed the locks to protect what is inside. Because life, in its own time and in its own way, always, always collects what is owed.